The Last Temptation of Homer is a great episode, one of the very best of Season 5. It not only contains a classic marriage crisis episode, but also a nuanced look at Homer Simpson as a character. In fact, I'd argue it's one of the most likable and thoughtful portrayals of Homer in the series' history. But there's one fan theory that has sort of haunted this episode over the years. This small, sneaking suspicion that not everything wrapped up in a nice little package. So in today's episode of Simpsons Mysteries, we're getting into the weeds and answering that lingering question. Did Homer actually have sex with Mindy Simmons? So I kinda hate the idea behind this theory. There's a reason why I haven't talked about it yet on this channel. It kinda bums me out. This theory pretty much subverts the entire episode. That Last Temptation of Homer now becomes a story about a man who repeatedly resists the temptation of infidelity, only to finally succumb at the conclusion. That the image of Marge we see at the end is a total fantasy, a delusion by Homer to deal with cheating on his wife. A very different kind of story. However, I think there's a reason why this alternative interpretation of its ending exists. There are so many people who independently wondered the same thing. So it's worth examining how valid this theory is. First of all, let's talk about Homer himself. He has always been portrayed as a man with many flaws. Many flaws. The nickname Jerk-Ass Homer exists for a reason. Throughout the series, Homer has given the audience plenty of reasons to doubt his character, and his self-control in particular. The Last Temptation of Homer is constructed in a way to test these limits, to have the world conspire against him until he finally breaks. The episode actively goes out of its way to suggest that perhaps Homer and Mindy are better suited for each other than Homer and Marge. The audience understands the larger narrative point being made in the episode, but at a subconscious level, the Homer-Mindy ship gets stuck in our brains. Secondly, let's talk about fantasies. If the idea is that this is one of Homer's delusions, then there has to be some evidence to back that up. Does Homer fantasize regularly throughout Last Temptation of Homer? Yes, yes, and double yes. Homer is basically Walter Mitty in this episode, he daydreams so much. What's interesting is that these often involve characters morphing into other characters. His spirit guide initially appears as Sir Isaac Newton, then morphs into Colonel Klink, who Homer is more familiar with. Even more damning, when Homer is thinking unsexy thoughts, his good friend Barney transforms into Mindy wearing the same bikini. One of the main cornerstones of this theory is that Mindy and Marge are wearing the exact same red dress. Canonically, this was obviously done to surprise the audience with the Marge reveal. But the nearly identical outfits stoked the fires of this conspiracy. Why is Marge showing up in this dress that we've never seen her in before? That Mindy also happened to be wearing. If Homer has Barney and Mindy sharing the same outfit in his fantasies, what is there to prevent him from picturing Marge in one of Mindy's outfits? Psychologically, it's consistent for him to do so. Another potential discrepancy is in Marge's appearance. The version of Marge that shows up at the ending looks very different from the sickly version of her we saw in Act 2. If this is the real Marge, then why isn't she stuffed up anymore? Well, the simple explanation is that she simply recovered from her cold. And we have visual evidence of that fact in Act 3, when she tells Bart that he's all better now. Marge looks completely fine right here. So, unfortunately for this theory, we have to toss out this piece of evidence. Next, let's talk about Capital City. When Marge sits down next to Homer, she tells him, "This was a wonderful idea." This implies that after rebuffing Mindy, Homer called up Marge and invited her to come over to the hotel in Capital City. The sticking point is the driving distance between Springfield and Capital City. In previous episodes, like Dancin' Homer and When Flanders Failed, Capital City tends to be portrayed as a substantial driving distance away, where this would be a major move for The Simpsons. This freeze frame from Dancin' Homer suggests that it's at least 220 miles away. In a season 15 episode, Bart has to take a plane to visit Milhouse in Capital City. I've always gotten the vibe, especially in these early years, that Capital City is like 2 or 3 hours away from Springfield at the very minimum. But your guess is as good as mine. The reason this is relevant is because of the timing of events. Homer and Mindy go to dinner at Madame Chow's and don't return until that evening. Look at that moon in the background. Let's say it's 8 or 9 p.m. We'd be looking at a situation where Homer calls up Marge, she drops everything, hurriedly gets a babysitter, and drives over to meet Homer at like midnight or 1 a.m. This is obviously possible. The whole point of this ending is that it's unexpected that Marge comes out of nowhere. That's the point. But given the machinations of getting Marge there that same night for a romantic rendezvous, maybe the simpler explanation is that this isn't actually Marge. That being said, we don't actually have any proof that this is happening on the same night as this. Remember, Smithers tells Homer and Mindy that they're providing a 2-night stay in Capital City. We see them arrive at the hotel, order room service, go to the convention, go to dinner, then it's back to the hotel, all presumably on day 1. There isn't anything in Bart's storyline to suggest that this stuff takes place on 2 different days. To add to the confusion, we don't actually know how many days the convention is. Now it's possible the reason it's a 2-night stay is because the first day is for travel and getting ready, the second day is the convention, and then they leave the following morning. Crowning Homer and Mindy the king and queen feels like something you do on the last day of the event. If this interpretation is true, then we never see the first night that Homer and Mindy stay there. Even if we come to the conclusion that this is actually night 2, it's certainly possible that after this whole ordeal, Homer booked another night as a romantic getaway for them. Marge's comment is too open-ended to draw definitive conclusions about the timing of the events. What is less vague is her comment about the turkey behind the bed. Marge is clearly surprised by finding it there. Now this line doesn't make a lot of sense if this were actually Mindy, since Mindy was present for its initial discovery. Nor does it make sense for Homer to start singing his "Oh Margie" song to Mindy. You could argue that if Homer were deluding himself to deal with his guilt, that maybe his mind is making up all this stuff too. Sure, he's projecting his image of what Marge would say onto Mindy. I think this is a pretty big stretch, to be quite honest. If this were a romantic fantasy, then why is his brain putting in all these random elements? I'm not a psychologist by any means, and don't really want another dive into Homer's subconscious, but I would expect Homer's fantasies to be more straight to the point, especially a fantasy that is sexual in nature. If he were doing Chili Peppers, you might have a point, but not here. After the conclusion, we don't hear anything about these events until the Season 6 classic, Another Simpsons Clip Show. After Marge recounts her near affair with Jacques, Homer retells his story about Mindy in detail. He talks about their introduction, his fantasies, the convention, his breakdown, and his reunion with Marge. We don't hear Homer actually tell the story, but the assumption is that he's describing every clip shown to the audience. Marge does not look particularly surprised by his version of events. Compare Homer's reaction to Jacques to Marge's reaction to Mindy. She just looks sort of annoyed and asks what happened to Mindy. If Marge didn't ever go to Capital City, the whole story would be a complete blindside to her, and we get a much more confused reaction. We also learn that afterwards, Mindy hit the bottle pretty hard and lost her job. You could argue this either way, whether this strengthens or weakens the theory that they slept together. She could have turned to alcohol after having a one-night stand with Homer and finding out he isn't willing to leave his wife. Or she could have taken the rejection we saw in the episode really hard. Or maybe it's totally unrelated, and Mindy, much like Homer, has an addictive personality. It doesn't have to be related to these events. By the way, since we're discussing this point, I've always really hated that the writers wrote off Mindy Simmons this way. The Last Temptation of Homer portrayed her very sympathetically, and this description strikes me as callous and unwarranted. I don't know what Mr. Pennywise, the writer of the episode, was thinking. Anyway, this is pretty much where the Mindy Simmons story ends. They never did a Lurleen Lumpkin-esque follow-up episode in the modern seasons. At this point, I feel kinda mixed about this theory as a whole, that Homer did indeed have sex with Mindy. Because yes, it's true that Homer does often live in Fantasyland. His grip on reality has been tenuous at times. Marge driving all the way to Capital City, especially if this happened the same night, is pretty darn far-fetched. On the other hand, there are explanations for the timing of all this stuff, as well as Marge getting over her cold. And the clip show afterwards doesn't make any sense at all if Homer really did sleep with Mindy. To accept this theory, we have to accept that while Homer is screwing Mindy, The Simpsons is screwing the audience. And then they mislead the audience a second time in the clip show. I think it's pretty unlikely that in this third-person omniscient show that we get exactly one scene from strictly Homer's POV. I said at the beginning of this analysis that I kinda hate this theory. However, I don't want to be too hard or negative on it, because I totally see why this interpretation exists. Like, it's legitimately a creative and interesting idea, this weird dreamlike viewpoint of the ending. Like something out of a David Lynch film or something. As an idea, it's really cool. If The Simpsons wanted to play around with reality more, actually go for an unreliable narrator concept, I would totally be on board. It would be a neat experiment. I think I'm always going to be predisposed to reject this interpretation because the show has gone out of their way to demonstrate that this is a line that Homer wouldn't cross. They've been very clear about how thoughtless, violent, and mean-spirited Homer can be. There's an entire era of the show about that. But they've repeatedly put Homer in situations where he could very easily cheat on Marge. So many women throw themselves at this guy. And yet, he never does it. Even when he drunkenly marries his Vegas wife, they go out of their way to clarify that they didn't do anything. I honestly wouldn't be surprised if canonically Homer's number, so to speak, is 1. Does anyone really think he was successful with the ladies in high school? I think that fellow YouTuber Toonerific Tariq summarized this dynamic best.
People always forget that when creating a character, it is definitely important to say what they will do. But it's more important to know what they won't do. Homer will lie and steal, but he won't cheat on his wife. He won't let his daughter down.
Thanks, Tariq. Now, I'm not arguing that Homer not cheating on Marge makes him a great person or anything. But when you have a character who has done so many questionable things, you're more likely to cling to the remaining stuff. Homer and Marge's loving and committed relationship is the bedrock of the series. And, as Treehouse of Horror 4 told us that same year, Homer pledged his soul to his wife, and nothing would ever change that. Not Mindy, and not a donut.